Welcome to Only for Your Ears and today's episode 35 on Judgment Day by Hans Christian Andersen, which I've renamed Crossing the Final Threshold. The structure will remain the same, starting off with a brief summary where I'll digress and have a few reflections. Next will be my critical review on how this fairy tale plays in today's society, with a few examples from films or political comments that's made on TV. And last but not least will be the trigger points, good or negative trigger points, or good or bad trigger points. And that will be the final part of the episode. So let's begin with On Judgment Day, or Crossing the Final Threshold by Hans Christian Andersen is a fairy tale that explores themes of self reflection, humility, and mercy. The story begins with the death of a devout man known for his adherence to religious traditions. I digress. I get the impression Mr. Anderson could have been a religious man himself. No judgment here, though. As the angel of death appears to escort his soul, the man is confident that his good deeds will secure him a place in heaven. I digress. This is truly unfortunate. A lot of Christians feel because they have followed the doctrine of the church they attended and faithfully read the Bible, they're entitled or think they've earned the right to enter heaven. If that's the case, I truly don't understand why Christ came to earth. During their journey, the man and the angel of death observe a masquerade representing the various disguises and hidden animalistic aspects of human nature. I digress. So society has sadly become privy to the inauthentic self of a lot of Christians. There are clergymen that perform religious duties who don't even believe in God. The man is shown the peacock within himself, representing his pride. They then encounter Blackbird's embodiment of the man's evil thoughts and lust. I digress. I suffered from pride for a long time. I didn't know it was the root of unforgiveness, which I had a big problem with too. The angel of death also reveals that the sharp flint stones causing the man's pain are manifestations of the careless words that hurt others during his life. I digress. I think from birth we have all been given the gift of the freedom of speech in Western societies. However, depending on our gender, race, and class, there are restrictions, but with freedom comes responsibility. Upon reaching the gates of heaven, the man is questioned about his faith and actions. He boasts about his strict adherence to religious laws and his efforts to eradicate evil. I digress. The pious Christian must have felt confused by the angel of death's questions, because I think God's unconditional love is a big commitment and promise that most Christians find hard to accept. This is why the man started orating a list of all his good deeds. The guardian angel points out that his beliefs are not aligned with the teachings of Christ, which promote forgiveness, love, and mercy. I digress. Sometimes the doctrine of the church doesn't always align with God's teachings. Yes, this is a big one for me concerning different fractions of society. The man is momentarily humbled but still insists that he's deserving of heaven. Typical. Reflection. The importance of self awareness. The tale illustrates how individuals often focus on their external actions without acknowledging the hidden motives and intentions that drive them. I digress. Yes, this is prevalent even in the church. By examining one's inner self, individuals can identify their shortcomings and work towards personal growth. I digress. I left the church and spent many years as a hermit. In some ways, even before I left the church, this was because I was wrestling with the spirit and myself about forsaking who I am as an individual to fit into church and society. This is typical, people. A lot of people do this. As the gates of heaven open, the man's soul is overwhelmed by the divine light and music. He realizes the weight of his pride, cruelty, and sin and feels unworthy of entering heaven. I digress. It's amazing what we think is a great sacrifice and display of good virtue on this low vibrational planet, which doesn't measure up to God's eyes at all. To, to in this humble state, to he pleads for the mercy. The angel of mercy comes to him, offering the mercy he did not expect, and God's everlasting love fills his soul. Another reflection, the transformative nature of divine love, the overwhelming experience of divine light and love at the gates of heaven lead the protagonist to a profound realization of his own unworthiness. I digress. The realization all our good deeds do not measure up to the internal spiritual realm to enter the gates of heaven. I don't think it has anything to do with God, but it has to do with entering such a heavenly realm. Coming from a low vibrational place like Earth, after this, after this demonstrates the power of divine love to transform and purify souls, guiding them towards the spiritual growth and ascension. The tale concludes with a reminder that all humans still experience this humbling moment on their judgment day, but through God's infinite love and mercy, they will be carried through other spheres, ultimately ascending into God's eternal light. Well, that was an eye opening summary. I mean, I had a feeling that this was the case, but to really read it and to realize it is something else. So let's move on to my critical review on how this fairy tale plays in today's society. I loved this fairy tale because as a person who is going through my spiritual awakening, I could see this narrative through a more non-judgmental lens than before, with the realization that when our judgment day comes, we will all have to experience the humility of begging for mercy, no matter what our good deeds are. There is no exception to the rule. We are not pure enough to enter the realms of heaven from such a low vibrational planet like Earth. I believe Jesus was created in order to prepare us for our day of reckoning, although most Christians still believe they have performed enough deeds by pledging an oath of commitment to Jesus, who died on the cross for us through adhering to these teachings. We have done enough, but I don't think we'll understand the magnitude of such a requirement until that final threshold, people. There's a film that impressed me a lot. I've seen this film many, many times when I was growing up. It's an old, old film. It was made in the 40s or 50s. It's called Angels with Dirty Faces. A fine example of a movie that proves that not all great Christian films equate the cinematic hagiography, which means the undue reverence. Angels with Dirty Faces concerns a group of young wannabe hoodlums, basically, what they call the dead end kids, who fall in with a local gangster, William Rocky Sullivan, played by the great James Cagney in his days. After his release from prison, as a child, Rocky's partner in crime was Jerry Colony, Pat O'Brien. However, in the years that followed, Colony turned his back on the reckless youth and became a man of cloth, a man of the robe, a godly man by profession. Father Colony now hopes to encourage the dead end kids to follow in his footsteps. But as he says, it's hard to teach them honesty when the streets continuously show them that dishonesty pays better. And this is the way it is in society also. Dishonesty pays better. Oh, you told the truth. You made a mission statement. You told the truth. Now you're going to lose your job from this multinational company. Telling the truth is considered a bad thing, and being dishonest is considered a way of survival. Christianity then is shown here as a helping hand ready to give the deprived teenagers an alternative path to one offered by the criminal underworld. In a different era, it would have been a perfect material for the American Italian director Martin Scorsese. Now we're going to switch to the ending of the film, which I find quite interesting. Jerry walks with Rocky as he is being led to his execution. He implores his friend one last time, but he's gruffly rebuffed. As they enter the execution room, Rocky stoically shakes his hands and shakes Jerry's hands and wishes him well before walking to the electric chair. Then, out of nowhere, Rocky seems to break down, begging and screaming for mercy. Exactly what happened in the fairy tale. It has Christian Andersen. Rocky begins whimpering like a coward, and this requires the guards to subdue him and forcefully drag him to the chair. It must have been so frightening for him. Rocky seemingly dies as a coward's death. Later, Soapy and the gang read in the newspapers of how Rocky turned yellow in the face of his execution. How gory. And they refuse to believe it. Jerry, the man of cloth, comes in and Soapy asks if it's true that Rocky had died a coward, and Jerry affirms that it is true. The gang no longer knows what to think about Rocky or the criminal lifestyle, and Jerry then asks them to accompany him to say a prayer for a boy who could run as fast as I could. Bless. That's all I want to say. Bless. You know, this man of cloth is so condescending. It's unbelievable. But I have something to say. Rocky didn't die a coward's death. Because if he died a coward's death, then you can say that the devout Christian in Hans Christian Andersen died a coward's death as he was begging for mercy because he was so overwhelmed by the divine spirit and the music as he ascended into heaven. Rocky felt overwhelmed by the immediate sense of death and the ending of his life. That's why he was begging for mercy. It had nothing to do with being a coward, I don't think. The priest sounds as though he was in competition with Rocky when he says, "Oh, a boy that couldn't run as fast as I could." I mean, how pathetic is that? When he made the comment about how fast he couldn't run, the priest knew that Rocky would never surrender. He was begging for mercy. Isn't that what we're all supposed to do on our final day of crossing the threshold or on our day of judgment? We're supposed to beg for mercy, to eliminate pride from our lives. Because in the end, even the most pious Christian or Catholic will have to do that before they enter the realms of heaven. Next is Franklin Graham. Talk about a pious Christian whose father was the great Billy Graham, a preacher and a man of God that was awakened. Franklin Graham, son of famed preacher Billy Graham, was recently a target of criticism after inflammatory comments he made about Democratic presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg. As a Christian, I believe the Bible, which defines homosexuality as a sin, something to be repentant of, not something to be flaunted, praised, or politicized, he wrote on Twitter. Now, the Bible says marriage is between a man and a woman, not two men and not two women. His tweet was in response to remarks Buttigieg made on CNN, in which he said, and I quote, "This is very true. This comes from Romans. God does not have a political party." Well, that doesn't come from Romans, but what he said next does come from Romans. God so loved his children, he sacrificed his only son. Now, this is very true. He loved all of his children, not just one or two or three. He loved all of his children, that he sacrificed his only son. Does not mean, didn't care if you're homosexual or not. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say whether you're disabled or not, what color skin you are. And so this is perfect because I've been repeating this over and over in my mind when I was going through struggles, when I was in the church. It had nothing to do with homosexuality, but it had something to do with being different. And I did not fit in to the elite fractions of the church. So there were a couple of things in the Bible that I wanted to speak of. The word of God is evident in its view of homosexuality. The most commonly quoted Bible verses are Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus 20:13, which state that it is an abomination for a man to lie with another man as he would with a woman. Well, it's an abomination to be a married man and sleep with a woman that's not your wife outside of your marriage. That's an abomination. And David did that with Bathsheba. You know, honestly, there's sometimes I just think some of the teachings in the Bible don't quite match up to modern day society. And my question is, should they or shouldn't they? It's a big, big, big question. Anyway, I just wanted to say this. Now, I'm a Christian, but I removed the rose-colored glasses a long time ago as I was struggling with being a different type of person. I have never really fitted in to the mainstream of society. This doesn't mean sexual identity, but the essence of who I am. I always felt as though I never belonged here, in church, or even on the planet. However, through my faith, I realized my core resides within me and not with what people think. My self esteem is in me and how I feel about myself, not how other people feel about me, and not out in society's construct. But I hate the cherry picking, which it is, people, the cherry picking of acceptable and unacceptable sin that runs through the church and then wrapping it up in the shroud of Christ as though it's a biblical doctrine when it is not, when it is absolutely not. The last temptation of Christ was a hugely controversial upon its release. The last temptation of Christ seeks to humanize the Son of God. Well, Jesus was made human. That's what's the main reason why he came down to earth, so he could understand the temptations of people and why they committed sin. Temptation is the core of is the seed of sin, but it isn't the behavior of sin, and it is the behavior of sin that is condemned. You can have the desire to want to sleep with someone outside of your marriage, for example. But if you don't act on it and you're honest about it to your wife or to your husband, then it's not a sin. But when you keep it inside and you try to push it down, and then you eventually keep that lie tucked inside of you, or you commit adultery, then it is sin. In fact, the argument goes it is precisely because Jesus is able to overcome these temptations that his crucifixion was significant. Without temptation, there is no sacrifice. Nevertheless, many Christians took offense at the film, specifically its depiction of the eponymous temptation itself, in which Jesus descends from the cross to marry and raise a family. Ooh, I can imagine. But contentious though it may be, Sarkozy's film offers perhaps the most human and relatable version of Jesus, yet committed to celluloid, rendering his work easy to identify with by believers and non believers alike. Now, their suggestion that Jesus was sexually attracted to Mary Magdalene, but this has been dismissed. But I would be surprised. She was a temptation, of course. Of, of course, she was a temptation, but the church doesn't want to admit that. In fact, the church has a big problem with abstaining. And because they have such a big problem with abstaining, I think, or abstinency, I think this is the very reason why you've seen behind closed doors in the Vatican and throughout the church all types of stuff going on sexually. They will not admit their desires. They tuck it away, their temptation. They tuck it away. They've done it for years. Now it's coming out more in the open, but they've done it for years. So let's take a look. Jesus frees Mary Magdalene from a spiritual bondage to demons, also called evil or unclean spirits, controlling her life. Demon possession was exhibited in a variety of ways: blindness, deafness, muteness, seizures, irrational behavior, crippling of the body, cutting oneself, or violent behavior. Anyone who was in such spiritual bondage lived a miserable existence. There is no spiritual evidence that Mary had been immoral. A church leader around 500 AD associated Mary with the immoral women in the previous passage, Luke, but there is nothing in the biblical text to support that. In fact, Mary Magdalene was a steadfast devotee to the Bible's teachings and to Jesus. Now, let's take a look at the trigger points. Now, let me tell you, I've been triggered all the way through this. And I would say this has aroused my passion for justice and truth and conviction and honesty, which has been very, very good for me. So this is a good trigger as well as being a bad trigger in some ways. The trigger points. Martin Luther King, the imperfect martyr. The trigger for me is the church vehemently defends pastors and preachers and people in the politically correct realms in church for their slanderous behavior. They turn a blind eye or make indefensible excuses for them. But anytime it's someone outside of their political realms, for example, they condemn and sometimes make it impossible for that person to stay at the church. Where's the logic in that, I say? Dare I say they aren't following the doctrine of the Bible, but their own doctrine. Now let's turn our focus to Martin Luther King, the imperfect martyr. Now, something that Coretta King, his wife, the famous Coretta Scott King, with her flowers, artificial flowers that Martin Luther King gave her, said, I wouldn't say it was exactly love at first sight, she said during a 1961 interview, but we liked each other a great deal, and we seem to have a great deal in common. Let's continue now with Martin Luther King. Washington, for years, his enemies in the FBI sought to discredit Martin Luther King Jr. by leaking audio tapes of a supposed sexual encounter between King and an unnamed woman. No reputable newspaper took the bait. Because he was supposed to be a saint and a black man being a saint, that's a miracle. They were too afraid to touch that story. Now, the man who was King's most trusted friend has succeeded in doing what his bitter enemies could not accomplish. The detailed confirmation of King's alleged sexual escapades, 3 in the single night before his death, has been supplied by Ralph David Abernathy, an intimate of King for virtually the whole of King's public career, and the man tapped by King himself to be his successor. Martin didn't want me to buy these window curtains, Coretta told me in a 1983 conversation in the living room of that home where she continued to live. King's belief was that he was unworthy of many of the tributes that came his way, fueled by an aesthetic which is a very disciplined type of ostentation from many, many different things, except for the desire to which his only exceptions were rich food, good suits, menthol cigarettes, hard liquor, and extramarital sex. So many sins there, of course. Described kings witnessing a rape in a hotel room. Instead of stopping it in handwritten notes, in his file say he encouraged the attacker to continue. King was once thought of as a saint beyond reproach. After his death, it eventually emerged that he was a womanizer. I can believe it. And there's no real need to be judgmental, because when I did read it the first time, I wasn't judgmental, and I'm going to try not to be judgmental now. The FBI's files contain some other notable information. Garrow writes that King may have fathered a daughter with Dolores Evans, a girlfriend of his, who is still alive and living in Los Angeles. The memos also detail the closeness of his relationship with Dorothy Cotton, a longtime associate of King's in Atlanta and the director of his organization. Many of these transcripts were based on audio tapes that are still sealed under court order until maybe indefinitely, or until it's more appropriate to release this type of evidence. So it's obvious that King felt totally unworthy, and the pressure of being perceived as a saint was too much to bear. So he flagrantly wanted to throw his sin behavior in the face of anybody that would witness it, including having 3 women in the bed the night before he was assassinated and witnessing a rape. In fact, one of the women that was raped was part of his congregation, and he laughed apparently out loud. It's on tape. What I will say is that I think his behavior had a lot to do with him feeling unworthy and not feeling that he could live up to the title of being called a saint. And that, I think, is prevalent in the church. I think a lot of people have a difficult time living up to this perfect God Almighty person, that they go crazy. They just go absolutely crazy. Let's take a look at another one that triggered me. Sinead O'Connor, the famous Irish singer, beautiful woman she was, who caused a lot of controversy as a musician, as a singer, as an activist. Despite all of the rotten things people want to write about Sinead O'Connor, she was a mother, an artist, an activist, and had a steadfast attitude to her faith. Activists who fought against her own demons and survivors of sexual abuse. Excerpt. Born in Ireland to a mother who horribly, horribly people, mentally and physically abused her. Don't tell me she wasn't bitter and angry. She could never get over that. What a pity. She wasn't able to reclaim the justice for herself by transmuting her family karma. It's not easy at all, I write. Now, the woman who prepped her, she's famous for Nothing Compares to You, that was written by Purple Rain, Purple Rain. Oh, who's the man from that? Oh, God. Prince, of course, Prince. And she's also famous for doing something on Saturday Night Live, which a lot of people say it was really unforgivable. Okay, so the woman that prepped O'Connor during this her CNN performance remembers the singer confiding in her the reason for the protest. Her mother had horribly abused her, and she could never get over that, Shook says, and she blamed the church for that, and rightly so. In Ireland, when she was growing up, the church would tell her to be a better child, as though the reason why her mother abused her had to do with her being a bad child. I mean, totally the responsibility and the wrong footing of the church. And there were incidences that would happen where she would see a child being abused by parents when she was taking her oldest child, Jake, to school. And it would just floor her, like surprise her. Things would trigger her. Her childhood would trigger her. She blamed the church for turning a blind eye to the abuse they were coercing through members of the church. Yes, the Catholic Church, and also I would say the Christian Church too, uh, you know, have a part to play in this attitude. And she was as I said, she was a mother. I think it was in July, just before she passed away. She wrote a Twitter to all to anybody of the parents that are survivors of children that commit suicide. And she says to all of the parents that have seen their children pass and that have committed suicide, I give you my heart and my love. And then a couple of days later, apparently she committed suicide. It's written in the newspaper that she died of natural causes, of course. Um, but she could never get over losing her child to overdose. Because let's face it, nothing compares to losing your own child and having to bury your child before you die. Must have been heartbreaking. And that's why I said at the very beginning, she was a mother first. Before she was an activist, she was a mother first. She became a member of Islam 2018. I say it was a spear in the eye of the church. Policies and church doctrine versus God and the Bible doctrine. I think she was really giving the church a black eye, to be quite honest. And the last but not least is Josh Orstein, pastor of a really big famous church in the United States that holds uh, an audience of 16,000 people to almost 20,000 people in Texas. This is the pastor that gets so much money. The church, the Christian church and the Catholic church, they are the two richest religions in the world. They have money, 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 money. Unbelievable amounts of money. And there was a flooding in Texas, a huge flooding. And it was unbelievable. It was reported in Lakewood. Neither Lakewood nor Austin's official accounts responded to these queries. What happened? There was a huge flooding in Texas, And there were parishioners that came to the door of the church because there was no flood in there. It was just wet on the ground. And they begged, they said, please, can you give us shelter? And he told them to go away, go to the nearest shelter. Well, the nearest shelters were flooded. And that's why they came to the church asking for help. And they said no. So neither Lakewood nor Austin official accounts responded to these queries, which only fueled suspicion as to why the normally vociferous evangelical was so tight-lipped. He wouldn't say anything. Photos emerged of a flooded Lakewood, but they didn't come from the official accounts. And dubious Twitters were quick to point out that the photos were taken in only one part of Lakewood's parking garage. Fact-checking the Snoops.com. Both Lakewood and Austin's Twitter accounts further jeopardized their credibility by apparently blocking users who questioned why the megachurch wouldn't open its doors to aid the tens of thousands of people displaced by Hurricane Harvey. The debate gained national press attention before Osteen and the other Lakewood leadership provided an official statement about the church's involvement in hurricane relief. Okay, so we're just going to stop here. But the thing is that it's not until they were humiliated, literally humiliated by the lies about not protecting and helping their own parishioners in this flooding disaster that they decided to open the doors and let a couple of hundred people in, and maybe 1 or 2,000. But that was it. They weren't going to extend themselves. And then the church got involved in another scandal. And this is with money. Over $600,000 went missing in 2014. Checks and donations, tithing from the church, and it was reported. It was reported, and then in 2020, 2021, all of a sudden it managed to reappear. And apparently it was a plumber that found this money underneath the seat of the toilet in the church. And to be quite honest, I just feel this is I think this has to do with the church and its greed and the lifestyle that his family has been running. And he was holding on, he was hoarding the money. I believe that. That's what I want to believe. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's the truth. Just because I want to believe it, it doesn't mean it's the truth. So, where do we have it here? I believe in God and the doctrine of the Bible. I believe that God so loved his children that he sacrificed his own son. I do think that there are certain things in the Bible that need to be updated and looked at. But I think a lot of people are confused between the church doctrine and the Bible doctrine. I would go with the Bible teachings all the time. And I would not put my self-esteem in the hands of human beings, whether they're Christians or not. That's the end of today's episode. Well, thank you very much for listening to this episode, and thank you for the shares, the likes, the views. I really appreciate it. And I'd just like to leave with my typical comment, and that is, healing is a lifelong lesson, blessing, and gift we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Healing is a lifelong lesson, blessing, and gift we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Until next time, take care, look after yourself. Lots of love. Goodbye.